Okay, everyone, welcome to another day of the Interstitial Cystitis Walk for a Cure, Walk for Awareness. I'm really excited for this expert interview series to continue with Dr. Laura Santurri. We are actually both members of the Interstitial Cystitis Association board, and I've been on the board for just a smidge longer than Laura, for 5 years for me, and I think, Laura, you're about 4 or so. So Dr. Laura is the chair of the Department of Interprofessional Health and Aging Studies and the director of the doctoral program of health science and at the University of Indianapolis. And as a little side note, she has also been a finalist as Teacher of the Year 2 years in a row. So bravo. And so I thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it today. And I'm just going to kind of throw it to you and have you give yourself a short little bio, both personally and professionally, because as many of you people don't know, you actually have interstitial cystitis as well.
Correct. Well, thank you, Nicole, for the opportunity. I really appreciate being able to chat with you today.
Yeah.
So I do have interstitial cystitis, and I've had it for just over 2 decades. And symptoms started around 14 or 15 years of age, and like many, had a delay in diagnosis. So I wasn't diagnosed until I was 18 years old. And over the past over 2 decades, it certainly had a number of impacts on my life, both professionally and personally. Professionally, I have found a way to kind of weave it into all of my educational experience. It was, for me, a way for me to make sense of having the condition. So in my undergraduate studies, I focused on medical anthropology. In my graduate studies, I moved into public health and health education and health promotion. And that's really where I started to focus in on how to be an active self-manager with chronic disease. And really built that into my educational experience. Because if I can find a way to help us better understand how people are living with this condition, and then on the flip side, how we can better cope, that brings some meaning for me. And of course, personally, it's had a number of effects on me. Many, I would say, challenges. But in addition to those challenges, I will also say that I think I am a stronger person, and someone who you might say appreciates the small things just a little bit more. So it's had its challenges, but it's also brought some opportunities to my life as well. And I really appreciate my connection to the Interstitial Cystitis Association. Right when I was diagnosed, I immediately actually took over a support group. And I relied on the ICA. They listed my support group on the website. I often referred support group participants to the ICA for resources. And I got involved in other ways, doing Capitol Hill walks. I had the opportunity to serve on a patient panel for the NIDDK. So I built that relationship over time, and I had seen the calls for applications for board members a number of times.
Yes.
And
Me too.
finally,
I ignored them for quite some time as well.
Yeah, I kept looking at the email thinking, gosh, I should do that. And then, it just wasn't the right time. But I finally got to the point where I decided it was the right time. And I'm really, really glad that I did. So like you said, I've been an active member of the board of directors for the past about 4 years now, active on the communications committee. I had an opportunity to co-facilitate a webinar on relationships in IC. And I've also had other opportunities, like being able to provide patient testimony in front of the FDA. So it's opened a lot of doors for me, and it's given me a way to give back to an organization that's given a lot to me as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's really great to see how you took something that could have been so, and albeit challenging, but could have been very negative in your life, and then turned it into something that has been, in a way, it's something that's enhanced your life. I actually have a question for you, because I feel like, I see a lot of patients with IC as well. And I feel like there's this overarching feeling of dread and doom that you won't be able to do the things anymore that you once were able to do. And while that's true for some, and it's more challenging for some than others, you are a runner. And can you talk a little bit about just some of the things that you've done physically, despite interstitial cystitis, that you feel like has maybe been a way to sort of cope in a way?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think I have found ways to still accomplish the things that I want to accomplish, even if I have to modify them a little bit. So I did become a runner, and I started, I got into this really, really negative place, and living with chronic pain can take you there. But I got to a place where I found a treatment that worked fairly well. And I had always told myself if I got that treatment and I could start feeling a little bit better, I was going to make a change. And I was pretty overweight. I was smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day. I'm not proud of that.
Okay.
But I made the decision to quit and start moving. And I started very slow. I could barely walk around the block. And I have to attribute a lot of the support that I got to my dad, who was an avid runner beforehand. And he, was very patient, and eventually got to the place where I went from barely being able to walk around the block to completing my first 100-mile race last October.
100?
And I'm not saying everyone needs to run a 100-mile race, but I do think, I think it's important for people living with this condition, whatever it is that you want to do, whatever it is that you aspire to, it's still possible, and the 100-mile race that I ran, it's 5 20-mile loops. And the reason why I like that loop in this very beautiful park in northern Indiana, I like that loop because, you guessed it, there are bathrooms all along that loop. And, so it makes me feel safe. It gives me some comfort. And if I need to stop, I can stop. There's plenty of aid stations for me, and rest stops. And so, that's where I choose to do a lot of my runs, but it works for me. So I think you have to keep in mind that while you may have to modify things slightly, there's still so much that you can do.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I see that, no pun intended, I see that in a lot of my patients as well, right? We take them from a place of this, like, oh no, I'm not gonna be able to do anything, to actually, we're helping people to realize goals that they didn't even know they could have at the beginning. And it's a journey, right? It's not easy. And I'm sure there's ups and downs and stuff, but your story is inspiring. And I hope that it can be inspiring to many people, no matter where your physical abilities lie right now. And it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't have to be a 100-mile race, because crap, I couldn't even do that. Right. I could barely run around the block. But you know what I mean? Like there are ways to be able to achieve your goals if you get the right team in place to sort of help you in the right support system. And I think that that's one of the things that one of the reasons why I want to talk to you, because you are also a professional expert at that as well. So we're going to talk about that here in a second, but I do want to move to something that, you're kind of putting your money where your mouth is in terms of really wanting to learn more about what makes people successful with any chronic illness, but in this case, interstitial cystitis. So you have headed up something called the IC Hope study that I was hoping you could give everybody watching this a little bit of an update on, and a little bit of background in, because I think it's really cool. And I think we're going to be able to glean some great information from it, hopefully when it's all completed.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I named it the IC Hope study very intentionally. And hopefully that becomes clear. This particular study was actually a 2-phase study. So one of the first things that we did was we actually sent out a survey via the ICA community. And we wanted to get a little bit of information about people living with IC, specifically around their mental and physical health, their perception of the role of pain in their day-to-day life, and also interested in their perceptions around sexual satisfaction and function, because I saw that as a potential gap in the literature and something that was important to ask about. So we sent that out. We've actually disseminated those results via a peer-reviewed conference presentation last fall, and we're actually working on a manuscript right now. But what I can tell you about those results, we had just over 500 people in our sample that we analyzed for this particular portion of the study. And we saw, I think, some interesting things. So first of all, as compared to the general population, we see that people living with IC have lower rates of sexual satisfaction, which for many of the people living with this condition are probably not going to be surprised by that.
Right.
But we also saw that as compared to the general population, they had similar interest in sexual activity.
Yeah.
And again, unsurprisingly, one of the factors that seemed to play the biggest role in disrupting a healthy sex life was pain. And that was both sexual activity, both with and without a partner. So what it tells me is that I think that sexual health potentially maybe an overlooked area in IC patients' lives, but I think it's an incredibly important area where we might be able to do some things to improve quality of life. And I'll talk a little bit more about that probably a little bit later. The other thing that we saw that was interesting was that people who reported being 60 years of age and older had better physical and mental health and lower rates of pain interference in their day-to-day life as compared to patients who were 40 years of age and younger. And I'm not sure exactly what to make of that yet, but I think that's an interesting area to explore.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the quantitative side of things. Now, of course, there are some limitations with that. So with my sample, we did have folks reporting majority white women, college educated. We did obtain our sample through the ICA listserv. So there may be things about that group of people that you're not going to be able to necessarily generalize those results to the entire IC community. So that's important to note.
Yep.
But with our second phase, so the part where we really get to the IC hope piece. So what we did is we looked at that survey data and we actively recruited people who had physical or mental health scores that were either about average as compared to the general population or a little bit higher. And we did that very intentionally, and it's not at all to devalue the perspectives of people who aren't doing as well. But one of the gaps that I saw in the literature was there really isn't a lot out there about people who are doing fairly well, what it is they're doing to cope with their condition, what's working for them. So we intentionally recruited people with, average or above average physical and mental health. And we recruited nine participants, and we asked them to do a series of things with us. They completed an initial interview with me. They went away and did some reflective exercises, which I think are kind of fun. We gave them a set of questions and they did some journaling to respond to those questions, but they also took photographs to respond to the questions as well. So it had a really cool visual component. So if you think about it, sometimes a photo can tell you something that you can't necessarily express well in words. So we did that, and then we also did a group debrief where we got groups of the participants together to have some discussion about those photographs, and really wound up, from my perspective, with some really rich data. We are in the process of finalizing our analysis, but what I'm seeing in the preliminary results, I think, are two very prominent themes. And I would say that one is the importance of having quality, positive support in someone's life, and the importance of being an active self-manager. And I can talk a little bit more about that, what I mean by that and some of the specifics of the findings. But while these results are preliminary, I do think that there is some really good learning here, and I think some potential opportunities as well for when we think about how we can help patients improve their quality of life.
Yeah. And then when you talk about quality positive support, do you have any sort of either data or either in this study or others about, like, is that positive medical support? Is it positive family support? Is it positive friend support? Or is it anything that's perceived to be positive?
All of the above,
Okay.
really. So what we saw in our study, and I think this is borne out in other literature as well, is that this condition can be pretty isolating. And I think, even for myself, I can see myself when I'm not feeling well. I'm pretty good at disconnecting or withdrawing.
Yeah.
And that definitely, we saw that in the study results. And so I think, having people in your life who understand what you're going through. So some people reported the fact that they had friends and they had people around them, but the problem was that they had to continually explain to them what their condition was, or some of the challenges or implications of living with that condition. So that can be really challenging, or, having family that maybe disregard or, don't see it as serious necessarily because they can't see that you look ill.
Right.
Or don't feel well. And so I think that was part of that. So having people who understand you, who advocate for you. So if you're with a group of friends and you have that person who says, when people are talking about where do you want to go to dinner, you have that group of you have a friend in that group who says, well, let's go to this restaurant because I know that they have options for you there. that kind of advocacy. That's really meaningful to have that in your life. Having someone who can help give you some distraction from things. One of my favorite examples was someone took a picture after going skydiving with her friend. And not that everybody needs to go skydiving to get some distraction or escape from the day-to-day life with the condition, but having someone who is able to kind of just take your mind off things, I think is really important too. And I think, the related point here is I think we saw some really interesting stuff about the online community as well, because for some of the people who I interviewed, some of them, I was actually the first person with IC who they had ever spoken with.
Ooh.
And so, thinking about how disconnected you might feel, a lot of patients go to the online community to find support. And that this online community can be a really great resource for social support, information, education, ideas, being able to connect with people who actually have the condition, who really understand what your day-to-day life is like. But we also found that some online communities are not as helpful as others. So some patients reported finding the online community to be kind of negative and not as helpful. Others found that there were places where people were making claims maybe that weren't as true or as fact-based. And some people reported some places feeling just a little bit not like a safe space to be able to share. So it's kind of two sides to that. It can be an incredible resource, but it kind of depends on the resource as far as how helpful that is.
For sure. And, I feel like it's interesting because the Interstitial Cystitis Association just started a Facebook group
Right.
that's a support group, right? So it's definitely a fine line, right? Because I can see the advantages of having it being patient run, right? And a lot of them are, but then you sort of get to everyone sort of just ends up saying something that's worked for them, which again, it can be great, but then also there's things that, that might not be best for everybody, that might actually be harmful in some cases. And there's not really a good monitor of that, or an arbiter in that group that can discern through those things. So one of the, and that's a challenge, right? Because now, I happen to be in the Facebook group for the Interstitial Cystitis Association, but it's a big task. And as the group grows, it becomes a bigger task. And so, that's one of the things that hopefully we're actually you don't know this yet, but we are going to ask you to help us train the admins of that group, actually, so that as part of the communications committee of the ICA, we're going to hopefully be able to help that place be a safe place, be as evidence-based as we can, but still honor the fact that people can have different experiences with different treatments and stuff. So hopefully you find that's you'll kind of give that the goal, the check mark of approval.
I would be happy to help with that. It is a fine balance, but one worth seeking. Totally.
Now I want to also really quick go back to, because I'm a pelvic health physical therapist, so I'm always into how can we make the sexual satisfaction and even just talking about painful intercourse or other sort of social aspects of intercourse, or even just sexual desire and stuff like that, right? So I really, really honestly just thank you for adding that in, because across all parts of the literature in pelvic physical therapy as well, it's like an area that's sort of still, we don't really want to talk about that. And with and without a partner is also a huge aspect that no one wants to talk about.
I know it can make people a little uncomfortable, but you look at the data and, people have sexual desire and want to have a healthy sexual relationship and sexual activity in their life. And that people should be able to do that. That is part of being a human being.
Yes.
So I think we need to,
regardless of sexual orientation.
Absolutely.
There's all kinds of studies that are all focused on this heterosexual group, right? Where it's suddenly the woman just has to take penetration and stuff like that. And it's that's not really the entire breadth of the sexual experience. And so I'm just really excited that that's a part of this study, so we can change the conversation around that as well.
Yeah, I think even just having people talk about it more and be comfortable saying the words honestly, I think it goes a long way. It's at least a start.
And for anybody watching, we also had an expert. She's a pelvic health physical therapist that wrote a book called Sex Without Pain, and her name's Dr. Heather Jeffcoat, and she specifically talks about people that have endometriosis, interstitial cystitis, and other sort of things like vulvodynia, vaginismus, for the female side, and then also painful erection and ejaculation for the male side of people that have either chronic prostatitis or interstitial cystitis. So that's what worth watching as well, as part of this expert series. All right, so we've talked about that importance of positive community. We talked about the online community and how isolating it can be. And now I want to talk about your thoughts on like the logistics of how to be an active self-manager with IC. So if you can sort of enlighten us.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, again, this was another prominent theme in our data. And what was interesting was that we had kind of an interesting dichotomy of report about relationship with healthcare providers. So some folks, when I asked about, tell me about the role of healthcare providers in the management of your IC, the response was none. And then other folks saw providers more regularly and had them more integrated into their treatment plan. But regardless of that, really, in either case, people were reporting taking on, I think, a fair amount of kind of personal responsibility for the day-to-day management of their condition and thinking about treatment plans. So whether that was going online and finding what has worked for other people or reading the ICA's website about the different kinds of treatment options, some people reported going to their provider and saying, hey, I would like to try X. Would you prescribe that for me or help me find a provider who does that? So really being very active and taking on that kind of personal responsibility. I think the other thing that folks noted was that, what works for one patient may not work for another. This condition really manifests itself differently depending on the patient. And so that kind of means that, different treatments are going to be, potentially really effective for someone else and maybe not for you. And so recognizing that diversity in the patient population, I think, was an interesting part of that. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that a lot of the effective treatments, we really tracked very carefully what people mentioned about what works for them.
Yeah.
And I would say the majority of the treatments that they mentioned were not things that were prescribed by a healthcare provider. Now, that is not to say that some folks were not using treatments that were prescribed that work. So I don't mean to imply that, but there were a lot of things, anything from making sure you stay hydrated, to using a heating pad, to various supplements, to wearing loose clothing, to making modifications to their diet. There were a lot of things that people can just do on their own and have chosen to do on their own that makes a big difference in their symptoms. Now, the other side of that, while there are these strategies that people can engage in for self-care that gives them some sense of control over the condition, they do have a flip side because some of those do come with a cost. And we characterized cost in a variety of ways when we looked at the data. So not just the traditional sense of the financial cost, but also the cost in restriction and limitation. And I think that was an interesting thing to note as well.
That is super interesting. And I feel like too, and this is a theme that I see when I see my patients, is that it's almost like people think that there's an either or route. Either I find a good team that works, a medical team, or I have to do it all on my own. And, with the AUA guidelines, which people that are in the participants of this race will get a copy of them, right? It's interesting to note that the first line of the AUA guidelines is all self-care techniques.
Right.
I think that sometimes we feel like, oh, well, people should just know that. It says like dietary changes. And it's like, well, that's a big task.
Right. What does that mean?
Yeah. What does that mean? And like, I feel like I know how to eat healthy, but it's challenging with interstitial cystitis and any other condition that you might have on top of that, endometriosis, IBS, right?
Right.
So I think you bring up a great point that we really want there to be that blending of both, finding a medical team, getting the medical interventions, and knowing the limitations of each of those areas. And then finding someone to help you sort of navigate that whole path is then sort of, a challenge. But then I think, to your point, an important piece that you need to actively look for.
Right.
Okay, so what do you feel like are some actionable items for people based on everything that's in your brain, based on everything that's what you've known both professionally and personally? What are some actionable items for people to implement in this?
Sure. So I think, kind of thinking about the two major themes around kind of social support and being an active self-manager, I would say first, I think it's do the best that you can to the best of your ability to surround yourself with people who accept you, care about you, and celebrate you. And I use that word very intentionally because it is okay to put boundaries around relationships in our lives.
Mhm.
And I think it's where we can. I know we can't always, but I think that where we can, really thinking thoughtfully about who we spend our time with, I think is really important. And if you have a group of friends who, when you spend time with them and you walk away and you come home from the night, that maybe an evening out, well, now things we're not really having a whole lot of
Maybe.
evenings out, are we? Maybe when you end your
Zoom
Zoom
meeting.
call,
Yeah.
um, if you don't feel good after that, that's telling you something. And I think if that's the case, it's okay to limit the amount of time that you spend with people like that. The other piece of this too, because this really applies to all relationships, I think it also applies to the relationships that we have with the healthcare providers in our life too.
Mhm.
In the relationships and IC webinar that I did, we talked about your relationship with a provider, and we talked about preparing for visits with a provider, maybe considering having an advocate come with you because sometimes it's hard to absorb everything, or maybe you're not going to think of all the questions you want to ask in the moment. And you want to have a provider in your life who welcomes those things. I mean, I think with any kind of chronic condition, you really need to have a provider who is going to treat you like an equal partner in your care, because it really needs to be the case. So finding someone who treats you that way and welcomes those things, I think, is really important.
Mhm.
So I think spending time with people who, when you end the Zoom call or you hang up the phone, you're feeling good and positive and refreshed. Wherever we can do that, I think that's really important. Now, the related piece of this is thinking about your relationship with your partner or your spouse, and kind of getting back to some of the things that we talked about previously. One is just having, open communication with your partner. And I think it's even more challenging in this day and age where there's a lot of screen time, there's an awful lot of distraction, but really thinking about setting aside time for good communication where you can engage in things like active listening with one another. That goes a really long way in a relationship, and certainly builds emotional intimacy. Now, I have in the past encountered people when the topic of sexual intimacy has come up, they kind of revert to, well, you can have the emotional intimacy, and yes, emotional intimacy is really, really important, but so is the physical intimacy. I see patients, we have a right to have a healthy, happy sex life. I see patients,
All
we
right.
have a right
Yes.
to have a happy, healthy sex life. And when you're, for example, meeting with a provider and maybe you're evaluating a treatment that you've tried, the outcomes that you're talking about, whether or not you can have that healthy, happy sex life is one of those outcomes by which you can measure whether or not a treatment is working. It is not only okay, I really would strongly advocate that you talk with your provider about it. And I can say for myself that over the years, especially early on, that was not something I wanted to talk to a doctor about.
Mhm.
But I've come a long way, so much so that I've actually found, the role of physical therapy, and having a really good physical therapist who specialize in pelvic floor and how important that is.
Mhm.
So I think, you know, you can have a good, happy, healthy sex life. It's going to take some work, but I think working with your partner to be creative, to explore, to be open about it, about what feels good and what doesn't.
Mhm.
I think, and that can vary. I really think that is a place where, as patients, we need to feel empowered to talk about it, and I would really want providers to be receptive to that. I
Yeah,
think
and
that's
open. I mean, I always hear so many the horror stories about when you actually do that and
Yep.
get up the courage to say something to somebody, and then it's just
Mhm.
like, oh, just have a glass of wine. Well, of course that doesn't work for a lot of reasons with
Well, let's
interstitial
just make things
cystitis,
worse.
right? So, but I 100% agree, and we're super big advocates of that as pelvic PTs. And
Mhm.
then I feel like there's, I coach my patients a lot too, to be like, we can work so far on the physical side, and then we can also talk on some of the ways to talk to your partner. But then sometimes there's also other avenues of sex psychologists and sex
Right.
therapists that can also specifically work on, is the sexual relationship, what is the percentage of physical problem versus, long-standing issues of not having that aspect, right? Because I feel
Sure.
like the expectation sometimes is that people go from like 0 to 60, like, oh, well, I've got my pain down now.
Right.
Suddenly, I haven't had any sort of sexual intimacy for 5, 10 years. And now all of a sudden it's going to be like go time. And that's not
Right.
always how it works, for either party, right? I feel like
Exactly.
patterns emerge and stuff like that. So there's other ways, but if you have, like, to your point, right, if you have an active, supportive healthcare practitioner that can sort of steer you in ways that can, ask other professionals to help along
Hmm.
that way path too, then yes. And I love that you said that it's a right, because it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and it just to kind of piggyback off of one of the things that you said, when we think about a care team, it's not a failure to go to counseling. And I think sometimes people feel that way, and I would hope that they don't. And I think that if you're not sure where to start with talking with a partner or a spouse about these types of things, it is completely okay to seek some help with that. Just like you would if you have you broke your arm, you're going to go to the doctor. It's the same kind of thing. And so, I would hope that people would consider having someone like that as part of their care team as well.
100%. All
Yeah.
right. So we said, relationships with partners and spouses, and with
Yeah.
intimacy. Any other pieces
Yeah.
of
So
info?
a couple other things, I think that kind of get to being an active self-manager. I would say, the one thing that can be sometimes more challenging these days is seeking information from reputable sources. And I think it gets harder and harder to evaluate the claims that are made all around us, but especially certainly online. And being able to kind of sort through and figure out where you want to get your information and what you actually want to apply to your own life. And I think there are some things that you can think about. And I used to teach media literacy in
Ooh,
another program. And in media literacy, I think honestly, all of us probably need to brush up on that fairly regularly. So
100%.
it's this idea of evaluating a message, right? So if it's an ad or it's something that comes up on a website, really thinking through a few questions that can kind of help you sort out the credibility of a source. And one of the questions that you can ask is, well, what is the source? Where is this information coming from? And importantly, related to that, why is the message being conveyed? So is this someone who's trying to sell me a product? Not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be beneficial, but it just factors in one of those things that you want to consider. What makes it credible? Are there statistics or data provided as part of that message? And ultimately, if you're not sure how to evaluate something, ask someone you trust. It's always good to say, I read about this thing, this new treatment. I wonder what you think about this. So I think that's, it's a challenge, and it's always going to be an ongoing challenge, but trying to make sure that you ask those questions of any message that you see related to any kind of treatment strategy. And the other thing I would say is keep some documentation.
Mm.
After having this condition for almost 25 years, sometimes I'll talk to someone else who's living with it and they'll say, well, did you try X? And I'll think, did I?
Did I do
you
that?
know,
And if I
and
did, when was
honestly,
that?
right. And honestly, I wish that I had done a better job of tracking the different medications that I tried, the different kinds of, especially with diet, like,
Mm,
well, what's a trigger, and that really takes some really meticulous, I think, documentation to really get a sense for whether there's a connection to a food that you're eating or something that you're drinking and symptoms. Because ultimately, like, you don't want to restrict yourself if you don't have to.
totally.
So, I think that's what, and I think also tracking all the different providers you've seen, when you saw them. And I know that seems kind of you don't have to go crazy and have an Excel spreadsheet, but some sort of documentation, because that can help you maybe identify, like, especially if you're tracking symptoms along with it, you might be able to identify some patterns and say, wow, after I started doing this about a week later, and since that time, I've been feeling a lot better. So I think ultimately, and if you switch, if you have to switch providers, I've made a few moves in my life, and so I've had to switch up my care team. Having that documentation can be really useful for that as well.
Yeah, and as a provider, you should have somebody, to your point above, that welcomes that, right? Not rolling
Right.
your eyes at somebody that comes in with their stuff, but someone like me, I'm like, oh, good, because we were going to do that together anyways.
Right.
So, but I feel like, pattern recognition is really interesting because when you're in it, it's hard to see stuff. I mean, I've had numerous occasions where, we actually go through the timeline, even someone that's made it themselves. And then, you see like, oh, my symptoms, they know exactly when their symptoms started, 2010. But then it's like, well, what happened in 2009?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, my, grandfather passed away, then my dog
Mm,
passed away. And then it's just like all of a sudden you can start to see, not to say that everybody that has those things has interstitial cystitis, but you can start to see that how some, events play a role in your symptoms. And then that might give us clues as to what might be some of the best strategies moving forward as well. So
right.
totally love the documentation, but we don't need to be getting all beautiful mind about it either.
No, we don't. Exactly.
You have enough stress, right? But
Right.
in a way that can help to, sort of delineate like things that helped, things that didn't. And again, like I'm just a proponent of objective information that you can add to the provider, right? Because that's going to help them to be able to, number one, trust you, and
Hmm.
to create that provider relationship that can be based in that mutual respect.
Absolutely. And the thing is, like I said, we know that every patient can be so different. So having that information about you can really help a provider tailor a treatment plan for you.
Yes. Okay, so what is next for you? You're going to finish the Icy Hope study. Do you have any sort of timeline on that? Or like what's going on?
Yeah, so we met just about a week or so ago to kind of finalize things, and we've got one more analysis meeting, and then we're going to start writing things up. And really, my intent would be over the next, I would say, 4 to 6 months to really get the word out through a variety of mechanisms. Importantly, back to the community, and that's why I really appreciate being able to present some of these preliminary results today,
Yeah.
so it can be translated back. And my hope is that I can use these results to potentially craft some programs or some potential options for patients, to help them learn a little bit more about themselves and what they can do to be active self-managers. I've again, I mean, the chronic disease self-management piece has been a part of my life for 2 decades, and so if I can find a way to translate some of that learning back to the community and also evaluate whether or not it works, that's what I'd like to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, on behalf of the ICA community, on the IC community, everything, like we just really thank you for all your hard work in that. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for all of your work and your time. And for all of you listening and or watching, make sure that you watch for those study results. And we're going to be giving a little handout with all of Dr. Laura Santurri's recommendations, just so we can have that, like, I don't know, pin it up on your refrigerator or something, to be working towards like actionable goals for you to be able to make some small changes, which can make a big change in a lot of the way that you are handling IC. So thanks again, Laura. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was great.
Great. Talk to you soon.
All right.